Well, good afternoon everyone and welcome to Mainline Baits Carp Fishing TV. And you join me at Baker's Lake, one of the Embryo syndicates up in Oxfordshire. And I know what you're thinking, he's into a fish already. No, what I'm into is a massive ball of weed. I've picked a swim just based on seeing a little bit of activity, not a great deal. And the first thing I've done is to have a bit of a lead around, and as you can probably see by this, I'm going to grab a massive handful to show you. Oh, he says, look at the size of that. I'm clearly going to be fighting quite a bit of this. I've had a few casts out there and I've bought pretty much a lump of this on every retrieve. So it seems the perfect opportunity to go through my 5 top tips for fishing in weed. I'm going to clean this off a bit, have a few more casts and get straight on to tip number 1. Now, tip number 1 is not only important when you're fishing in weed, but it's also one of the most important things that I believe you can learn as a carp angler, and that is feeling the lead down. Now, I keep it very simple. I use my spod rod. I've got braided mainline, so there's 0 stretch in it, which means that any donk that you feel out in the lake is transmitted perfectly through the rod and you feel absolutely everything. But when you're fishing in weed, it can be even more important. You're looking for that telltale sign as the lead falls through the water, the lead hits the bottom, your rod tip springs back, and you know to start with that it's relatively clean. If you don't get a drop, if it feels very soft or that it's got caught up in the water, then straight away you know you're in the middle of a weed bed. But once you've got that lead down and you pull your rod back and you feel it across the bottom, it gives you a great idea exactly what that particular area is. Now, ultimately, the way I like to fish in the weed is where possible to find the cleanest area around the weed bed that's possible to find and present my rigs on that. So that's how I start off with. I'm going to carry on leading around now, and then I'll show you what I do once I've found what I believe is a very clean bit of the bottom. Let's have a look. Right, a clear spot has now been located, but just want to show you, nice and hard, hitting the clip, line tight, donk. So the next bit is when you pull it back through, lovely and smooth, all the way for a good couple of rod lengths. And I know that I've got a spot there that I can present my bait and rigs very accurately. But when you're fishing a weedy water, sometimes a smooth lead like that will slide across some silkweed along the bottom, just low-lying weed, and you might not feel it. So one last thing that I do to be absolutely safe is I loop this lead off and replace it with a dedicated marker lead like this one, and on that it's got 4 prongs, and if you pull that back across the spot and you don't get snarled up with any weed, you know you've found an absolute winner. So I'm just going to do that and see if that spot is as clean as I believe it is. Same again, rod tip up, hit the clip, donk. And what I try to do now, I want to give it one sweep through. As long as it feels clean, happy days. Then I'm going to try and get that lead up off the bottom as quickly as possible. Then I can just check if there's any weed fronds, any bits of weed around any of those prongs to find out if it is clean. So first thing, look at that. All feels good. Try and get it up in the air. I know I've reeled that in really quickly, but trust me, if there was any real silkweed, any horrible stuff on the bottom, you'd know about it. It wouldn't all come off. So Now I've found my spot, time to get some bait out there and not get caught on my watch. Oh, she's donking. Well, we are off the mark. I took the decision after spending time locating a clear area to put all 3 rods on the spot over a nice bit of bait, and this is the result. The first of what I hope is many. Now, one thing you do have to consider when fishing in weed is exactly how you bait up and what you put in your mix. So I'll get this one back, then we'll have a look at exactly what I'm using. Right, now it's been a little while since I had that first fish or only fish, and I'll be honest, I half expected another bite. So I put the rig back out with minimal disturbance, but now's the time to give them a little bit more food just to see if we can get the spot rocking and get some more fish on the bank. But before I do that, tip number 2 when tackling a weedy venue is the baiting approach that is, I wouldn't say it's always my go-to, but in this particular set of circumstances. So yes, I've found a clear spot out there, but it is definitely surrounded by weeds. So I want a mix that's working up and down the column. It's not just hard on the deck. Perhaps if you were fishing just a flat bed of gravel, you might like a big carpet of food out there. So as the fish come along, they're looking down and you know, they start to get amongst it. But when you've got columns of weed all around you, you want some food and some liquids that get caught up in all of that to entice the fish to drop down. So to start off with, I've got 2 different types of pellet. The fish in most of the embryo waters are fed a house pellet, as we call it, so I have to have that in my mix, but I also add in the activate response pellets. It means I've got 2 sizes of pellets, breaking down at different levels, leaking attraction all the time, and let's face it, you show me a carp that doesn't like a pellet and I'll be amazed. Then it's over to the boilie side of it. I've always said I like to use 2 different types of boilie where possible, and it's no different here. I've got the cell and I've got the link. Now, to start with, I put some 10 millers in there, a sort of a couple of handfuls of each different flavour. Then I put in some 15 mil, exactly the same, but this is where you start to get a bit crafty. Once I've got a load of 15 millers in there, I start off with the cutter and I start putting some chops, some halves, some quarters. Again, some of that will get caught up in the weed and just encourage the fish to start rooting around on the bottom. And once that's done, I then like to go for boilie crumb. Now that is gonna not only hang up in the weed, but when you sort of tie that in with different liquids, as the liquids come up through the water, those tiny, tiny particles are getting carried up and down as well. Now once it's all in, give it a right old mix up. I put hemp oil in a couple of different times. I put it in really early on, just on the pellet and boilie, and then towards the end as well, because I want as much of it to be saturated in that as possible, because again, it's leaking up in the water. When a fish disturbs it, it lets little plumes of it come up, and I'm adamant that if another fish is passing, it gets a whiff of that and drops down onto it. And finally, the Smart liquid. Because it's like a soluble fatty liquid anyway, it's constantly going up and down. And as I just mentioned, when you use that in conjunction with some of these finer particles, they're getting carried up and down as well. So you're not just baiting on the deck, you're baiting the whole column. There's bits getting caught up in the weed as well, encouraging the carp to dive in, and as we've proved, to have a little feed. Enough talking, let's get a little bit more out there. Well, how about that for a cracker? Just over 23 pound, my second bite, more importantly, my second fish landed. And it's all about putting things in your favour when you're fishing in the weed. 100% record so far, brings me nicely on to tip number 3, and that is to eject your lead. Now, I know what you're all thinking, he's telling us to drop the leads every time because he works for Corda. Well, trust me, that isn't the case. If I was fishing a lake that was relatively snag-free or clear-bottomed, I wouldn't be dropping the lead either. But when you're fishing in weed, the quicker you can drop the lead, the more likely that fish is to come up in the water and come in across the weed, giving you a much better chance of landing it. Now, there are a few different ways of doing it, and I use all 3 on different occasions. At the moment, I've got one out there on a solid bag, and that's utilising a drop-off inline. You can use the traditional lead clip, which, as designed, if the fish were to become snagged, then the lead can come off, or as I'm using here, the heli-safe. Now, it's a spring-loaded mechanism, and I suppose that may sound a little bit complicated, but it's either on the packaging, or as you can see here, it's really, really easy, step by step to put together. And the way it works, once the fish picks up the rig, tension from that end, tension from this end, it all pulls tight, a little shake, and the lead's going to come off. And like I said, that will make the fish come up in the water, and it gives you a much better chance of that fish coming in across all the weed and finding its way to the back of the net. I'm going to get me lead, get me rig back out. Right, tip number 4. Now, you saw me spend a lot of time checking just how clean that spot was out, and I'm pretty happy that it is weed-free, but there will definitely be, somewhere in that zone, there'll be some low-lying silkweed maybe, there might be some weed fronds around the spot, and to ensure that my rig is presented as effectively as possible, and to know that when those fish turn up, I'm putting all the odds in my favour of getting that all-important bite, I like to at least start off the session with a little pop-up like this, attached to, in my opinion, one of the very best presentations out there. It's the spinner rig. You've probably all used it, you've probably seen it loads of times, but just in case you haven't, I'll run you through how I tie it. I start off with about 9 or 10 inches of the 25-pound boom. I use the crimp tool rather than tying knots because it's actually stronger and a lot tidier. I crimp a loop at this end, that just enables me to put it onto a quick change swivel so I can change the rig quickly. I then crimp another loop at this end, but including a spinner swivel on it, so again I can change the hook quickly should I get a bite. You then simply put your chosen hook on. In this case it's a size 4 crank. I've then got I go for a coloured kicker more often than not, but some people prefer to use shrink tube. I prefer the kicker because once again, it enables all of those quick change properties and to get a new hook on there as quickly as possible. And the rig is then finished off with a hook ring swivel, a little hook bead, and the most important part of it is a reliably buoyant pop-up. In this instance, it's a 15mm pineapple juice one from Mainline. And I just know that that is going to be sitting out there, sitting pretty, doing everything it needs to do. So if a fish does pick it up and get away with it, because let's face it, we know they do, because the hook bait is always buoyant, the rig is so effective, it's always going to push away and reset itself, ready for the next carp to come along. It's getting dark. I'm going to get this back out there and hopefully we can have another bite or two. That's a bite. Right, we've got 3 rods back on the money for the night ahead, and it leads me nicely in to tip number 5. Now, whenever I snag fish or fish in heavy weed, one of the most important things I think you can do is to fish with your clutches totally locked up, not just really tight, but locked. There is no way I want the fish taking any line, and that works in conjunction with tip number 3, which was dropping the lead. Essentially, behind the spot, around the sides of the spot, there is lots and lots of weed. So by fishing locked up, the fish tries to take line, it's immediately coming up in the water, and because it's putting pressure on that end, there's immediate pressure from this end. The likelihood is that the lead is probably off before you've even managed to get to the rod. So the fish worked its way up in the water very, very quickly, hopefully away from as much danger as possible. And as long as you're on your rod nice and quickly, you've got a direct line and you can start getting the fish away from danger immediately. Don't be afraid of it, but respect it. I've got some really, really effective butt grips there that my rod is completely locked into position. There's no way that rod's getting dragged forward. I'm fishing at 80 yards range, so there's plenty of stretch in the mono. So as long as you do it correctly, it's the most effective and safe way to fish in and around heavy weed. Wish me luck. I'm gonna go and have some dinner. Well, there we go, the perfect way to end any trip. A fish in the net and another one landed, going for using all of those tips that I've been through. And when you fish a weedy lake, when you land everything you've hooked, you really walk away with a sense of achievement, because it can be a tricky situation. If you like the video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, turn your notifications on for the channel so you know when the next video's out. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you do. And to give you a few more carpy videos, there's going to be some links to some right here.